Welcome to Herbally Yours, an adventure into the world of natural medicine. Here is your host, Dr. Ellen Kamhi, the natural nurse who will help you take the leap to ultimate wellness.
Greetings, and thank you so much for joining me, Ellen Kamhi, the natural nurse, for another edition of Herbally Yours, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Herbally Yours brings you the latest information about the many facets in the world of natural living. Today, I'm going to talk to you about a topic that many of you would probably be very, very familiar with, and that is the use of the very, very common over-the-counter drug called aspirin. And that's what we're going to talk about today because, as many of you know, I've written many, many books. You can find them all at naturalnurse.com books. And one of the books that I wrote, called Arthritis, discusses things that are used for pain. Of course, our focus is on natural therapeutics that are used for pain. But aspirin is certainly something that people do take for all kinds of effects, including pain relief. Aspirin has a really long history. It's one of the oldest pharmaceutical drugs. It actually dates back to over 4,000 years ago when the Sumerians and the Egyptians were using components of aspirin. In fact, the Sumerians wrote about using white willow bark for pain relief. And even going further back in history, there's a great movie that any of you can actually rent and watch. It's also a book called Clan of the Cave Bear. And in Clan of the Cave Bear, the protagonist, her name is Isla. For those of you who have actually either seen the movie, it stars Daryl, and Hannah. And she actually is the protagonist in the story, Clan of the Cave Bear. And she goes around taking care of the elders. And she learned the medicine that she does from Neanderthals. Now, although the story is a fictional story, it goes through 6 books. Clan of the Cave Bear is actually a series of 6 books and also a movie, Clan of the Cave Bear. And although it is fictional characters, it was written by a person who is a brilliant anthropologist. And she based the entire knowledge about the book on known historic artifacts and facts. And in fact, a lot of the same information was used at the Museum of Natural History in New York. If any of you have gone there and you see those giant dioramas, I love that. I went myself when I was a child. I took my children who are now in their late 40s. I took my grandchildren there. It's a great place. And I'm sure many of you have visited. And they have these giant dioramas of how people lived in past times. And one of them is a big giant diorama about people living at the early time of Cro-Magnon man in the houses they lived in, which were round and made of bark. And so when we talk about bark, one of the things they actually used bark for was to make a tea. And that is what Isla is shown doing because she learned how to use white willow bark from the people who raised her. She herself was a Cro-Magnon person, but she was adopted and raised by Neanderthals. And that's because they have documentation as far back as Neanderthals actually using white willow bark as a pain-relieving remedy, which is quite amazing because we have Sumerian writings of 4,000 years ago. Now, what's so amazing about white willow bark is that you can use it today. They sell plain old white willow bark in the health food store, or better yet, you can come with us on an herbal walk. We do herbal walks locally on Long Island. We do them in Florida. We do them all over the country. and we go out and actually find a white willow bark tree. I bet you can find a willow tree, right? Many people can recognize a willow tree. There's no poisonous look-alike. A willow tree has leaves that droop down and they blow in the wind. They're, a very highly recognizable tree. And the bark of that tree, you can actually just get a branch and strip the bark off of that tree yourself. That's what we do as herbalists. That's what Isla did as the beginning Cro-Magnon man when she was taking care of her Neanderthal relatives. So this goes back in time a very, very long way. And that's what the Sumerians wrote about over 4,000 years ago, using white willow bark for pain relief. If you go to a white willow tree and just strip off the bark, put it in a cup, add hot water, and let it sit about 5 minutes, it will actually have salicin and salicylic acid in that solution, which is aspirin. And that's what we're talking about today, the history of using aspirin, but also the current modern research and recommendations that they have been doing, such as you might have heard about taking a daily aspirin. Perhaps your doctor has told you to do that. But we're going to talk about the healing aspects of it and some of the possible side effects that you should be aware of. So from that ancient history, they were not using an aspirin isolate. They were using white willow bark, and there are other plants that have salicylic in them, such as meadowsweet. That's another herb. And you can, of course, just go right to your health food store, and you can buy these things in bottles. They have them in liquid tinctures, which is a very easy way to take white willow bark. They have it in regular capsules, which is another really easy way to get white willow bark if you don't want to go out to a willow tree. I'd rather go out to the willow tree and strip the bark, but you might want to come on an herb walk first to learn how to do that. You might want to learn how to make dandelion tea by digging up dandelions from your lawn, washing them off, drying them, and making them into tea, which is actually something that is excellent for cleaning the liver. It's used in detoxification. So all the medicine is right there, as was aspirin, or its predecessor in the form of white willow bark. But one of the things I find so amazing about natural remedies is the fact that in natural remedies, if you believe in God, I believe in God. I'll just go ahead and say that on the radio. But if you believe in whatever you believe in, Mother Nature, science, whatever you believe in, it's pretty amazing. Then when we look at something like white willow bark, which has the chemical similar to aspirin right in it, but it also has other factors right in it, put there by, whoever you think runs things around here, right? So these other naturally occurring chemicals that are within the white willow bark are called demulcents in herbal language. And I teach classes all the time, for instance, in how to use natural remedies for yourself and your family, and also how to move forward to have a profession, like as an herbalist or an other aspect of natural medicine. So those are all things we can talk about privately. You can just always get in touch with me at naturalnurse.com. But what's so amazing is that when you look at what naturally occurs along with the salicin in something like white willow bark and meadowsweet, there are demulcent herbals in there, demulcing components. Well, what the heck does demulcent mean? Well, if you take herbal courses, you'll know, but I'll tell you. What it means is soothing, something that is soothing. It coats the membranes. So when you're swallowing white willow bark, there's salicylic acid, which can be somewhat agitating, although it has a strong effect as a natural pain relief agent. But right along with it are demulcents, which means soothing components. And what those soothing components do is they coat the membranes and they stop any kind of adverse effect of the salicylates and the salicylic acid. But when we make a drug, such as an aspirin isolate, there are no demulcents in it, and that's when we start to get in trouble. So again, white willow bark goes all the way back to the ancient Egyptians who used white willow to reduce body temperature and inflammation for fevers. And then perhaps you have heard of the Greek physician Hippocrates. Perhaps you have heard of the Hippocratic Oath. And Hippocrates used white willow bark to relieve pain and fever. And by way later in history, let's say the 1800s, not so far away from us, right? We're now starting a whole new decade, pretty interesting. But in the early 1800s, Europeans started to research the effects of this healing bark, the white willow, and also meadowsweet. And that's when they actually discovered salicylic acid. And then they started experimenting to see how much dosage should be used of the isolate, which basically is what turned into selling the isolate of aspirin. In fact, in 1899, the company Bayer, who, by the way, along with Park Davis and all the other major pharmaceutical companies that were already in business in the late 1800s and early 1900s, all used plant isolates. That's all there was. And then they started to copy it and make a similar chemical, and that is what drugs are. So in 1899, Bayer began distributing powder that they made from the white willow, and it was sold as tablets over the counter of this isolate that they prepared of the salicylates of the white willow bark, and they started calling it aspirin in 1915. So it goes back a ways, but certainly not as long as all the way to the Egyptians, which the full white willow bark does. So doctors gave aspirin to many people, and also they started to see that it had some side effects, such as the fact that it made bleeding much worse. And so then in an article published in 2019, that Harvard Medical School professor started talking about the risk of stomach bleeding, which we now know is that a very, very high percentage of people who do take aspirin regularly start to get a very severe side effect of internal bleeding. So much so that many, many people die of that. So like most pharmaceutical agents, they have a very positive effect, and that's why you might use it. But simultaneously, it can have a very negative effect. So what we always want to do when we take any therapeutic agent, if they're all natural, such as white willow bark, which has a much lower incidence of any kind of adverse effect, and it does not cause stomach bleeding because somehow miraculously it has a demulcent or soothing herb in it, versus drug-based aspirin, which has a stronger effect and also is a wonderful blood thinner, as is white willow bark, but unfortunately has an extremely high incidence of causing the adverse effect of bleeding to the point of where it is actually deadly, and many people die from it every year. So that's where we want to actually look at the studies and start to use the best science to make the best choice for ourselves. Well, we're going to take a little break right here, and I want to remind you that you are listening to Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Listen live online at nccradio.org or on iHeartRadio. For more information on today, well, the guest is myself, you can email whpc@ncc.edu. Stay tuned. Herbally Yours will be right back.
145 over 92.
180 over 111.
182 over 100. And I had a heart attack and a cardiac arrest. And then a stroke.
Your blood pressure numbers could change your life.
A lot of people don't understand including myself, I didn't, now I do, the impact of having a stroke.
My memory is shot.
When I woke up, I couldn't speak.
Lowering your high blood pressure could save you from a heart attack or stroke. If you've stopped your treatment plan, restart it or talk to your doctor about creating one that works better for you. Start taking the right steps at manageyourbp.org.
It's a new life, but I'm going to make it better. Coming back. Ask your doctor, check your blood pressure.
Brought to you by the American Heart Association, American Medical Association, and the Ad Council.
Welcome back to more right here on Herbally Yours. Thank you so much for joining us on the Voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, and today we're talking about aspirin. I'm Ellen Kamhi, PhD, RN, and you can always find me at naturalnurse.com. So happy to be talking with you today. We talked a lot about things that are used for blood thinning, for pain, and we're focusing today on aspirin, the use of aspirin. Because unfortunately, when we really look at the data, I know many people are told by their cardiologist that they should take a baby aspirin daily. However, when you look at the latest research, you need to rethink that and re-speak to your physician, because a lot of newer research is now recommendations for once-a-day aspirin have been pulled, actually, by the FDA because they have found that the risks of major bleeding far outweigh the benefits of preventing a heart attack for most people. So this is big news. And when I tell people to check back with their doctor, because usually the doctor, especially a doctor who's been doing this many years, will just say, oh, yeah, go ahead and take aspirin. Go ahead and take aspirin. It's part of what they give as a standard of practice recommendation. There are some situations where the risk might outweigh the benefit, but let's look at the newest research. Have you ever heard of the New England Journal of Medicine? So I am not pulling this from Herbs Today. I'm not pulling this from the New Age Journal. I read the actual medical literature every single day. That's where we come up with the fact that natural remedies are often a better choice because we have a higher, much, much better adverse effect profile, which means it's safer. So if we look at this article in the New England Journal of Medicine, and you can certainly look it up for yourself, it's called The Effect of Aspirin on Cardiovascular Events and Bleeding in Healthy Elderly. That's what this particular study was done. It's rather new. It was done, released in the New England Journal of Medicine, October 18th, 2018. And what they say is aspirin is a well-established therapy for the secondary prevention of cardiovascular events, which, as I said, is true. Everyone's put on it, sometimes all the time, without even having a cardiovascular event. But this study says the role in the primary prevention of cardiovascular disease is unclear, especially in older people. And the conclusion of the study is the following. Show this study to your cardiologist to help him decide whether you should stay on it, or perhaps you should consider using an all-natural thinner, because that's why they're giving it to people as a blood thinner after, to just try to slow down the effect of strokes and heart attacks, which is a good thing. Changing your diet, exercising, and using safe natural therapeutics is probably a much better choice, because the conclusion of this study in the New England Journal of Medicine and many other studies say that the use of low-dose aspirin as a primary prevention strategy in older adults resulted in a significantly higher risk of major hemorrhage and did not result in a significantly lower risk of cardiovascular disease than a placebo. And this study was funded by the National Institutes. So this is major science. So much so, it's not just this one study. It's study after study after study after study. And what they decided as a group is that the recommendations by the FDA, and you can look this up, Google recommendations of one-a-day aspirin by the FDA. You know, this is right on the FDA's website. Recommendations for once-a-day aspirin have been pulled by the FDA because the risks of major bleeding far outweigh the prevention of a second heart attack. So that's the thing to know. And there's other ways that you can go about helping yourself, because in 2012, that's when the U.S. Food and Drug Administration reversed their recommendation. This is in 2012. I read you a study from 2018. And there's a new one from 2019 that came out, recently. So I suggest you check this out for yourself. You can print out these studies. You can bring them to your cardiologist or your physician so that maybe they've missed the studies. Very often they're not up on what the FDA's recommendation in terms of the newest science. But this isn't so new. I mean, we're talking about in 2012, the FDA reversed the recommendation, concluding data does not support aspirin as a preventative medication for those who did not yet have a heart attack, stroke, or cardiovascular problem. They thought it may be worth using it if someone has already had one of those issues. But still, in this population, not only had benefit not been established, but very dangerous bleeding into the brain or the stomach was a very, very significant risk. And therefore, perhaps you don't want to increase your risk. Perhaps you want to pay attention to the most recent studies, like the one that I just shared with you, which is right from the New England Journal of Medicine. And there are many, many others. You can just Google it. This one's called, as I said, Effect of Aspirin on Cardiovascular Events and Bleeding in the Healthy Elderly. The fact that the FDA no longer recommends the use of aspirin. Now, by the way, remember we started out this discussion talking about that the same compounds that are in aspirin, which may be useful for helping to keep the blood thinner, to bring down inflammation. That's why doctors had been recommending it as something that might offset the effect, particularly of a second heart attack. But we can do so much of this naturally. If you increase your exercise, if you change your diet to being lots and lots of vegetables, how you can tell if you're eating enough vegetables. This is what I do with my clients who come to me to find out what natural remedies they can use for themselves. And by the way, I'll never say to stop a pharmaceutical, because although I am a PhD RN, I am a nurse. I cannot make any statement about prescription drugs other than share the science with you. But I work with people's physicians, and the physicians will often change their recommendation when the science is brought to light and when they actually look at and read the studies. But you certainly can start eating healthy. And what I recommend people do is actually take a blank index card with them around all day, along with colored markers. And every time you put something in your mouth, you go ahead and put a line of that color with your marker on that card. And your goal and your homework is to make a rainbow. That's what you want to do. Make a rainbow. And how do you do that? By eating lots of different colored vegetables. And that does bring down significantly, scientifically, bring down your risk of cardiovascular disease, of stroke, of a whole range of issues. And then there's lots of natural things we can use. As I mentioned, white willow bark is one of the things. Also, there's all other kinds of herbs that can be really, really helpful. As we said, organic vegetables have natural salicylic acid, and so that's something that is really, really good. Also, there are enzymes such as nattokinase. Nattokinase helps to break up the various things that cause blood clots. That's why you're taking aspirin to begin with. So that is something that you might want to consider. Nattokinase is an enzyme that is very, very useful. There's another kind of enzyme that you can actually purchase in the health food store that is called lumbrokinase, because that's been evaluated as an anti-tumor agent as well as an anticoagulant. So ginkgo biloba. Ginkgo biloba is a tree, grows all over the place on Long Island, and it's used for many purposes. And you don't want to just go get that tree, but you can easily get ginkgo biloba either as a liquid herbal extract or also in a capsule. And ginkgo biloba is quite a strong anticoagulant. That's why people take aspirin. But if you're already on aspirin and you're already on pharmaceutical anticoagulants, a long list of them, then you really should check with an herbalist or a knowledgeable health provider before you add in natural anticoagulants such as ginkgo biloba and white willow bark, because then you might be getting too much. Right? So it's an art and a science. But one thing we know is that the natural anticoagulants, such as white willow bark and such as ginkgo biloba, have a extremely much less and much lower adverse effect profile than does aspirin. So we're going to bring this show to a close, but I do want you to know that it's something you want to study. It's something that you can look up yourself, that you can print out and take to your physician. Look up FDA recommendations of low-dose aspirin. Print it out. Bring it with you. Look up the studies online that have been done by the New England Journal of Medicine, by the Journal of the American Medical Association, showing the risks of taking daily aspirin. And then decide if perhaps a different path might be better for you. And I'd like to thank you for listening today. You have been listening to Herbally Yours, produced in the studios of 90.3 WHPC, Nassau Community College, Garden City, New York. For further information, please email us at whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamhi, the Natural Nurse at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.